Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 60, May 9th to May 15th, 1862. Last week, we talked about the opening pitched battles of the Peninsula Campaign. With Williamsburg and Eltham's Landing, we have McClellan and Johnson really making contact with one another. Also, last week, we had Stonewall Jackson striking at the Mountain Department, which will open him up to focus his attention on Nathaniel Banks and his forces around Winchester. Jackson, as we will see, is going to continue to use the tactic of overwhelming smaller enemy forces and striking where the enemy is weakest. Just as a quick note before we get started, we will be doing another Patreon episode that will be The Great Locomotive Chase, another Fess Parker movie. It's actually going to make two Fess Parker movies for you Fess Parker fans out there, which I hope there are some at least. So please, if that sounds like something that interests you, we're going to talk about how much of the movie is correct, what is historically accurate, what is not. So be on the lookout for that in the Patreon feed. That's going to be coming out here hopefully this week. Speaking of this week, we have some naval actions that are going to come as a fallout of the withdrawal of the Confederate land forces. First and foremost, I think it is time to say goodbye to the CSS Virginia. Rather than being idle since the duel with the USS Monitor, the Virginia has been at least active as a psychological weapon against McClellan and the rest of the Union forces in the area around Hampton Roads. Josiah Tatnall, the new commander taking over for the wounded Buchanan, would steam the Virginia out from its lair at Norfolk on occasions. In doing so, he would make a few captures of Federal transport vessels. By steaming out, he would trade shots with the Monitor as well, remaining in the area to check the Confederate ironclad. Nothing really happened with these smaller engagements between the two vessels. Neither would want to get close enough to have a part two of their battle here that was in March. Tatnall's plan would be to attempt to ram and board the Monitor so as to capture the enemy vessel. It was actually fairly interesting what he came up with. They would board the Monitor, spike the guns, and blind the pilot house. Then they would smoke out the crew. Remember that the Monitor only has 2 guns in its rotating turret, so it would be a little bit difficult probably to spike those guns, but especially given the fact that the portholes in which the guns poked out would actually close when the weapons were withdrawn to reload. But the pilot house, remember, it was a problem when it was hit during the Battle of Hampton Roads, so that definitely is a weak area of the vessel. Unfortunately for the Confederates, though, this plan meant they would have to first catch the Monitor, so coax her into closer combat, which the Monitor was not willing to do. The more agile vessel would make sure to stay well out of range, her task being to make sure the transport and supply vessels would be safe. Actually, a suggestion by Robert E. Lee was that the Virginia slip by the Monitor and other war vessels in the area and wreak havoc on the lightly armed ships beyond. If not just the vessels around Fort Monroe, perhaps the Virginia could then move on toward Washington or some of the other bigger cities of the North, just as Lincoln and Stanton feared. Tatnall, though, would shoot down this idea, as the Virginia was not going to be suitable for travel on the open ocean. It does bring up an interesting point, though. Lee was convinced that the Virginia should be used as the weapon it was, and not saved. The Confederate Navy was worried about losing its best asset, so it was not used to the aggressive degree that the future commander of the Army of Northern Virginia would want it to. Personally, I wonder how it would have been different if Lee had held the prestige he did later in the conflict. Maybe then his opinion would be taken with a higher degree of consideration. And this is an interesting thought for sure, but we'll never know. With the withdrawal of Johnston, it was deemed that Norfolk would have to be abandoned. Benjamin Huger, whose name is actually spelled Huger, but it's pronounced in the French Huguenot way, would be responsible for the evacuation. In the haste for departure, there was a miscommunication with Tatnall, who was not aware of the lack of infantry presence. In order to pass shallow water, the Virginia would need to reduce its draft. The draft being the distance between the water line and the bottom of the ship. Essentially, they would need to make the heavy ironclad lighter in order to pass safely through the shallow water. Things would be complicated by the arrival of Wool and Union troops from Fort Monroe, capturing the battery at Sewell's Point and moving to occupy the city of Norfolk. Remember, one of our first naval actions was some skirmishing at Sewell's Point, way back in our first couple of episodes. It would be here in 1862 that the Confederate flag would no longer fly over these works. Running out of time, the Virginia was deemed too large to move through the shallow waters. Josiah Tatnall would go far enough to even call the pilots treacherous, but it was clear he would not be able to save the ironclad. Rather than let her fall into the hands of the enemy, the crew would slip ashore and the ship was set on fire. Eventually, the fire would cause an explosion and destroy the CSS Virginia. News of the demise of the best weapon the Confederate Navy had spread quickly. Certainly, no more CSS Virginia is news to McClellan's ears. This meant that the James River was going to be open to his exploitation. We mentioned very briefly last week when talking about Franklin's move up the York River, but part of his idea was that he could use the James and York Rivers to his advantage in the assault of Richmond, especially with the superiority in naval power he currently held over the rebels. Immediately, he would task a portion of Goldsborough's fleet to display the power of the U.S. Navy and hopefully further demoralize the people of Richmond. As the army, as well as civilian refugees, poured into the city, the situation seemed to be dire. In fact, Jefferson Davis sent his wife and children to North Carolina, and there were preparations for a train to take him out of the city should the Union break through. There would be further discussions to simply abandon the Confederate capital, and it would be here that Robert E. Lee would actually make a name for himself with an emotional outburst that Richmond should not be given up. The normally quiet and reserved Lee would pound his fist on the table and say as much, which, for all those gathered, was enough to move them to stay with the defense of the city a little bit longer. As I have said before, it has been suggested that Johnson was unwilling to make a stand at Richmond, and likely would have been okay moving on to find a different defensive area. Lee's expertise as an engineer would come into play, as he bolsters the defense at a place called Fort Darling. Fort Darling sat atop Drury's Bluff, high ground that overlooked the James River. Already, the importance of this work was well known to the Confederacy, with earthworks being placed there to defend the city. August Drury, whose land it was that the fort was placed, was actually present as a member of the artillery defending the James. In addition to 8 pieces of artillery, there were various underwater obstructions that were sunk below the bluff, including the CSS Jamestown. The CSS Patrick Henry, with 1 additional gun, would be stationed nearby as additional support. Confederate sharpshooters and Marines would be on both shores to add small arms fire to the fray. Even with the Army providing support in the way of Lee, and actually it should be noted that Lee's own son was sent there to oversee the preparations, it would still be a Confederate naval operation. Ebenezer Farrand would be the overall Southern commander. Farrand was one of the first officers in the Confederate Navy and will continue to command a squadron all the way until 1865. For the Union, the expedition was commanded by John Rodgers. Rodgers had been in the Navy since 1812. Already in the Civil War, he has been present at Port Royal and was an aide to DuPont in his actions along the southern coast. Commander Rodgers would rise to the rank of Rear Admiral before his death in 1882. He would personally be commanding the new ironclad USS Galena. Now, we have mentioned the Galena before. She was the model that Bushnell was making when he sought help from John Erickson, who was the creator of the Monitor. Apparently, she was just as odd-looking as the Monitor, being constructed using interlocking iron plates. These plates were described as making the vessel appear as if it had scales. Before being totally approved for combat, the Galena had to undergo a few modifications, as the interlocking plates were held together with bolts that, if impacted, had the chance of shooting out and harming the crew inside, which, if I am part of the crew inside, is an understandable concern. Also included in the expedition would be the USS Monitor and USS Naugatuck. The Naugatuck was another interesting ship, in that it was a converted screw vessel turned ironclad. Its special power, if you want to call it that, was that it could partially submerge by filling compartments with water. This would make it difficult to hit the smaller ship. 2 wooden vessels, the Aroostook and Port Royal, would also provide support to the 3 ironclads. Before reaching Drury's Bluff, the squadron would travel along the winding James and encounter various Confederate fortifications along the river. These were small and poorly supplied and manned by various militia forces, so they would not pose too much of an obstacle. Rodgers would have the Galena shell the works until they fell silent before moving on. Their journey began on May 8th. By May 15th, they approached Fort Darling. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, the Galena would open the contest by firing on the Confederate guns. Early on in the fight, there were several mishaps for the South. One of the guns was actually disabled, falling off its carriage. Despite this, the Plunging Fire proved to be effective on the Union vessels. Now, we may or may not have mentioned exactly what that is, and maybe some of you have figured it out via context clues, and if so, gold star for you for today. But Plunging Fire, so we are all clear, are projectiles that, based on their trajectory, fall directly on top of an intended target. So, if you have, say, and this is a wild example, an ironclad with armor on its sides, but not so much armor on the deck, then you could imagine that to be a problem. With the Galena taking fire and having issues against the Confederates on the bluff, the Monitor would move forward to assist. Here now we have the second problem of the day for Rogers. Because of the turret and the way in which the guns sat in the turret for the Monitor, she would not be able to elevate them high enough to reach the Confederates. After taking a few shots from the gunners, the rebels would realize that she was not going to be able to do them any harm and focus their attention back to the Galena. At this point, the Monitor would withdraw out of the fight. With the Monitor out, the Naugatuck would move forward to try to help, but her main gun would burst, knocking her out of the fight as well. Meanwhile, sharpshooters from the shore would be harassing all Union vessels, keeping the wooden ships busy in the rear of the column. Marine Corporal John Mackey would courageously return fire with the enemy on the shore while aboard the Galena. This action would earn him the Medal of Honor. Mackey would be the first member of the Marine Corps to receive the award. The CSS Patrick Henry would join the fight, a shot from the smaller vessel hitting the Galena and setting her on fire. With this additional setback, Rogers would call the squadron to withdraw. A sharpshooter from the shore reportedly called out that their movement back down the river was in fact not the way to Richmond. Casualties were 15 for the Confederates and 27 for the Union. Not until 1864 would Drury's Bluff see action again. For the moment, just 7 miles south of the city, Richmond was saved. To close out, we need to talk about what's been going on in the aftermath of the fall of New Orleans. Essentially, with the fall of the Crescent City, the state government in Louisiana would deem Baton Rouge to be indefensible. They would withdraw to Shreveport, Louisiana, burning any cotton that was in the capital. David Farragut would send ships upriver to capture the city. Union ground troops would soon follow. The Mississippi River would seem clear now to the Union Navy, or at least far more open than it had been. Island number 10 and New Orleans had fallen very close to one another. Now Fort Pillow was the northernmost bastion of the Confederate defense, and to the south Vicksburg was still a strong position. If Fort Pillow fell or was bypassed, then Memphis would be the next target for the Union Navy. Memphis was important because the city had one almost complete ironclad and one that was still a work in progress. Despite things looking bleak, the Confederates would not give up just yet. They still had some cards yet to play. Now remember that Hollins had sent word he was going to New Orleans for the defense of the city, without waiting for permission from Mallory, the Confederate Secretary of the Navy. This action would see Hollins removed from command, but we have already discussed that. Now at Fort Pillow, there would still be Confederate vessels under the command of Thomas Huger, who would be mortally wounded in the Battle of New Orleans. He had led a group of river defense fleet vessels in an attempted surprise attack on April 12th. Union naval forces to the north, who were formerly underfoot, but now under Robert Davis, were not surprised and chased the inferior ships back down to Fort Pillow. Bombardments to render the fort would begin. Remember that Foote was wounded in earlier actions at Donelson and had to be relieved due to lingering complications. Robert Pinckney would take command of the vessels at Fort Pillow for the Confederacy, freeing up Huger to go meet his fate at New Orleans. Pinckney would reassign several of the vessels at Fort Pillow, leaving just 8 under the command of James Montgomery. Montgomery would hatch a plan to ram a mortar boat and capture a Union ironclad, as the bombardments were a regular occurrence now. Each time, a mortar boat with an ironclad escort would arrive, so they had a good beat on the enemy plans and their movements. It was resolved that they should give it a shot on May 10th, 1862. The USS Cincinnati, along with a mortar boat, arrived early in the morning. It was not long after that they dropped anchor where the 8 vessels of the defense fleet came around Plum Bend. The General Bragg led the way, and despite being hit by the Cincinnati, would successfully ram the ironclad. With commotion brewing, the USS Carondelet and the USS Mound City would steam out to investigate. Before they could get into the action, a second ram would find the USS Cincinnati, which knocked her out of the fight, sinking in shallow water. At this point, the ironclads would disable the General Bragg and the Sterling Price, but not before the Mound City saw the same fate as the Cincinnati, rammed and forced aground on the Arkansas side of the shore. It should be noted that even though the Confederate ships were facing off against ironclads, they were bolstered with cotton bales that added a cheaper and more abundant form of armor. Albeit though these were not as effective as the iron plates. The USS Carondelet, now the only Union ironclad in the fight, would move into shallow water, which saved her from the attacking rebels due to their inability to move too far after. Overall, there were only a dozen casualties during the Battle of Plum Bend. 2 Union ironclads had been disabled, but they would be salvaged, repaired, and put back into the Union fleet. While an interesting glimpse into the war on the Mississippi River, it would amount to very little in terms of the overall war plan. Fort Pillow would have to be abandoned after the Union capture at Corinth later in the month, as the supply to the fort depended on the key railroad city. Memphis would be open to the Union, but not given up without a fight, as we will soon see in June. Let's go ahead and pause there. So as promised, we have a naval-heavy episode. We say goodbye to the CSS Virginia, which is going to be the best weapon arguably the Confederate Navy is going to have. The Battle of Drury's Bluff actually saves Richmond from a potential bombardment from the U.S. Navy, and maybe a further evacuation of the city. If the U.S. Navy is able to move all the way up the James, then it's possible to land troops in compromising positions. Finally, we have the continued war on the Mississippi River with the Battle of Plum Bend. Next week, we will be looking at a lighter episode covering the Battle of Hanover Courthouse, as well as Princeton Courthouse. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website, Patreon, as well as Venmo information. Support for the general upkeep of the show would be greatly appreciated. Once again, feedback is welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.